And good morning, everybody. We're live. It is Friday, March. Wow, March. Can you believe it? March 4th, 2022. Hope you had a wonderful week. My name is Bryan with the Food Leadership Group and Food Safety Foundation. Now, it's going to be one of those days. And you have found the Food Safety Chat live. And every Friday at this time, at 8 a.m. Mountain Time, at 10 a.m. Eastern in the United States, we go live on Facebook, LinkedIn, and YouTube. And we talk about things food safety. And if you're new to this program, what you're going to find here is something that's kind of unique for what's out there. This is not a lecture, right? We're not going through a bunch of PowerPoint slides and telling you what we know, right? This is a conversation with experts who come in on particular topics, and they are here for you. And so you'll notice we have a nice chat window here, of which we pay very close attention to. And we will work your questions into the conversation. And I'm really happy today to have a guest on who I've been trying to get for quite a while. So he's a busy dude.
I've been trying to get on for quite a while. So don't go blaming me for all that.
So good morning, Dr. John Spink. How are you doing, sir?
Great, thank you. Yeah, to say March kind of snuck up on us. I feel like, I teach classes, and I think for, the last 6 weeks, we've been saying, oh, spring break's coming, it's coming. And all of a sudden it's here, next week's spring break. So the year is moving along. It's been a crazy 2 years. And it seems just, I don't know. So, but all is well.
All is well. That's the important thing. So everybody, please say hello this morning. If you're new to the show, one of the things we like to do here in the beginning is say hello to everybody. And my assistant, Renee, is on as well. So Renee will be putting out links and following up and moderating and making sure that John and I see your questions and all those type of good things. So Kimberly, good morning. How to join? Kimberly, you're here. So you got the link. You're all good. Good to see Tim. Tim is here on a consistent basis, and we appreciate that. So thank you, Tim. And let's see. Renee, okay, so Kimberly's joining with Renee. Okay, gotcha. Tammy, good to see you, my friend. Hopefully you're enjoying that wonderful weather in Austin. And so Kimberly is in Tampa. I have been to Tampa. It's been a long time now, a long time. So with this, everybody, in case you don't know who John is, so John is the director and the assistant professor at Michigan State University. And if you have anything to do in the food world, you know John's name. And so he's very involved and has done a fantastic job elevating food fraud and all these type of elements that sometimes
food fraud prevention,
yes,
not promoting fraud.
We don't want to promote it. No, we have enough of that as it is. Good morning, Cheryl. So this morning we're going to be talking all things food fraud. So before we get started, and John, one of the things I always do is I want to jump into our topics right away, but I always forget to have our morning sip of Joe. So everybody join John and I. Very good. And is that an Ember mug you have? Is that one because that's what mine is here. Is that one of the chargeable ones?
Those super thermal.
Super thermal. This one's chargeable, which is awesome. Okay. But they have a slight manufacturing defect, which has happened twice now. The charging base has a couple of pins that interact with the bottom, and if those pins get out of alignment or slightly depressed, it doesn't charge. Right. But they're super good at customer service, so they're sending me a new one. So
great.
Thank you, Ember. Oh, before we get started as well, all this fun housekeeping stuff is I wanted to make sure and give thanks to my sponsor, and this is always reversed. There we go. So EAS Consulting Group is our sponsor, and EAS is a consulting firm based in DC, and they do a fantastic job with putting together training programs and consultants for just an amazing variety of subjects. There are over 100 consultants who work in the food division with an average of over 25 years of experience in that area. So one of the things that I've learned in my career, and I'm sure, John, you've seen this too, is if you want to succeed rapidly and get things done, don't spend your whole time fighting, trying to figure it out yourself. Get with an expert and have them help you and learn from their mistakes instead of repeating all of those, right? So you can really leapfrog your growth. Mm-hmm. So make sure and reach out to EAS. They are offering 15% off training, which is amazing. And so we thank them for sponsoring us for that. So if you go to easconsultinggroup.com/training, you can check out their programs. And if you want, you find something you like, if you put Bryan, that's with a Y, in checkout in the discount code, 15% off. So thank you, EAS, for doing that. We greatly appreciate it. So, man, we got John, you're attracting a full house here. We got all kinds of people. We got Martin and Corey's joining us, and our friend Jill. Paula, nice to see you as well. So, man, we got a ton to cover here. So, when we had our prep meeting for this, man, it was just trying to condense the information that you've got, John, into a 55-minute call is really hard. So, we'll see what we can do here. And really, it's kind of around the evolution and what you're seeing in this area around food fraud. And so, can you kind of? I think that's a good place to start. So, let's kind of elaborate on that. What do you mean by the evolution?
Yeah, well, the thing is that a lot of times when we look at a problem, and especially a big complex problem, we start with our expert area.
Mhm.
So naturally, when melamine was in infant formula and pet food, that was a food safety problem. So it started in food safety. And the big question first was, what is it? So that's food authenticity. And we started there. But really, that's looking at, it's responding to the problem. And so these big complex issues have to be interdisciplinary because they're the root cause, the reason why they occur is interdisciplinary. And with food fraud, so I was on a call the other day, actually World Trade Organization, interesting to see what they're talking about, but there was a panel discussion about food fraud and realized that Frederick Ackum, ACCUM, he wrote his first book on the treatise on food adulterations in 1822. So we're
Wow.
200 years into this. So why are we still talking about it? But it's because of that interdisciplinary approach, starting with the problem instead of the solution. So
Mm.
for me, the thing that was unique is I was 12 years in industry. I worked for Chevron, so a large corporation, and worked for a small company for a year. And then before coming back to academia, I didn't have any single academic area. Now I got my PhD in packaging there in 2009, but I looked interdisciplinary. I had no single area to be in. So I just followed the problem. And it started in food science, to test it, to find it. But then the root cause, in food science, you put a kill step in. But you can't just heat the product and get rid of food fraud like you can kill a microbe maybe. But that was going to criminology. So I
Mhm.
actually started in the School of Criminal Justice. I was a professor there for 4 years. Then it really got to be more bigger system issues food. So I came back to food safety. But we ran into these issues of decision making. That's managerial accounting. That's how companies operate. So as of late, I've moved to the Department of Supply Chain Management. And I
Mm.
think that's really critical because we have to start. This problem is a supply chain problem. So if you had a medical problem, you wouldn't start with changing your running shoes or something. You'd start to look at the human side of you. That's the thing. Now we're looking at it from the supply chain outward. It's been really transformational for me, and I think it'll be transformational for our field.
Hmm. That's a good point. I like the doctor analogy, right? So if you go to your doctor and you say, "Man, I'm not feeling too good," and he says, "Here's some pills. This will cover up the pain." Oh, okay, I don't feel the pain anymore, but why do I have the pain?
That's
Right?
it.
Eventually, it's going to catch up to you. So you need to get to that root cause.
Yeah, and the key with the medical, we use the medical example a lot
Mhm.
because to take these different concepts and technical concepts can be hard to understand. You understand the words, but then how do you really apply them? But do think about that like a medical doctor. So it's almost like the food fraud prevention manager, the food fraud researcher needs to be extremely interdisciplinary. A multidisciplinary researcher thinking about a lot of these things at the same time. If you go to your doctor, your general practitioner, they are multifaceted. They might see that you need to talk to a therapist. They
Mm.
might see that you need physical therapy. They might see that it's your diet, exercise, the ergonomics, the way you sit. That's not just medicine. That's looking at you as a holistic person, the whole problem. So we look at food fraud as a whole problem. So the same thing is if I said, Bryan, you don't look so good today. You should have some vitamin C.
Mhm.
Well, maybe that's it, but I'm making complete guess. I have no idea. You might have brain cancer. You might have a broken leg. You might be dehydrated. I have no idea. You might not have got enough sleep. You're just completely guessing. So we do need to step back and look at the big picture. And again, that's why shifting to what it is. It is a supply chain problem. It's a supply chain risk. It's caused by the movement of goods, procurement, operations, logistics, and we're looking at the big picture now.
Mm. Well, and part of this then too, right, is unlike a pathogen or something of this nature, right, which is going to follow a prescribed course of how it acts. We're working against somebody who is actively working to fool the system, right? And they're doing it exactly the way you're talking, John. They're looking at the entire supply chain and saying, all right, what can I do to mess this up, right? How can I sneak in here and
Right,
do something, right?
right. Well, and it's interesting. So for 15 years, I taught graduate classes, online graduate classes, working professionals. Really interesting and deep. I mean, this is some real serious stuff. And then I moved over here to the Department of Supply Chain Management, and I teach undergraduates in person. So I teach the Introduction to Supply Chain class. So my job is to look at all supply chain at the same time, to develop the curriculum, develop a background research, to look at that, to train people. And so, when we're stepping back and looking at the big picture, we do identify a lot of those really big gaps. And so the thing we talk about is that it's not just the supply chain components, purchasing, operations, logistics, marketing, management, executives. Those are all just pieces. If they're not really integrated and connected, there'll be a gap. If the finance forgets to pay for equipment, you can't buy it. And that's the thing is with food fraud, we can do all these different things well, like manage the border, do a lot of testing, have great public policy. But if they're not connected, then there's big gaps and the bad guys just get through them. Think about, so the analogy I used in the class was your basement. So let's say that you do all this work on your basement and spend a lot of money and things, but one little crack in your basement could get flooded. So all this work and one little thing, if you don't look at holistically, the bottom line is why do you have to do all this work on your basement for worry about flooding? Somehow water's outside your house. Well, if you go outside, it's not about the basement, it's about what's going on outside your house. If you just get the water away from your house, you could have a million leaks and there wouldn't be a problem. That's the key here where we're trying to back up to look at the big picture and look at the integrated approach to then say, let's keep the water away from your house. Then we don't have to worry about these details. If not, if you just try to guard the border or guard your product, the bad guys are so efficient that it's going to break down.
Well, and then that's all they're doing, right? Is they're just constantly outside, peck, trying to figure out how can they get in. So and you're absolutely right. The holistic approach is the right way to think about this. And it was something that used to drive me nuts in quality, right? Is the company says, okay, we need to launch some new products. We need to be innovative. They go to R&D and they say, all right, you R&D guys figure out some stuff. And R&D runs around, and then the sales guys go out and make a bunch of promises. And they say, this is going to launch on this date without any knowledge of how long it takes to actually develop. Then the organization starts getting pushed, right? They go to the procurement group and they say, hey, you need to buy this stuff. And the procurement group's like, I never bought this stuff before. They're like, well, make it happen. You're the buying people. Okay. And then at the last minute, the QA people are called in and they say, oh, by the way, QA people, you need to figure out if this is safe or not. And you're like, well, what do you mean? Right. Well, we're going to make this in the plant in a week. Oh my God. Right. And then you're running around like a madman trying to figure out if this is okay or not.
Well, and see there, that's it. The pieces aren't communicating,
Right.
But let's step back a minute. And so I come from operations, and now I teach supply chain managers. I teach those procurement managers. One of the class I've been teaching is Introduction to Procurement. And we're the #1 undergraduate program in the country for developing students. And we're a huge program out there. So let's say that you go to that procurement manager at your company who got their degree, maybe their master's degree, maybe a PhD. We have a great PhD in procurement from MSU. And you say, oh, we've got to worry about these other things, this and that. They're going to say, look, I went to the #1 program. I never heard of your little thing. So yeah, you're Mr. Tech. You want your little equipment. You want to test for your little bugs. I've never heard of that. That's not in my set of things I should worry about. So that's the key. This is what I'm saying about supply chain management. For us to go back and say, okay, well, why does that purchasing manager not have in their set of metrics or their work process to be a part early on? But also you food scientists sit down and listen, because we've got a business to run here. You've got to roll. We've got to roll. So right. Again, so in the process of me moving over there, I have to then figure out, how do I present this? I think food safety is critical, of course, food fraud prevention, food defense. But then when I'm looking at it, a curriculum to say I've got 15 weeks and the class is already completely full, overloaded. What do I take out to put in? Not just food, but all quality. And that's where we started to look at how it fits into the big picture. Now, when we looked at it within their structure, it's really good supply chain management, includes good, thorough supply chain risk management. Good supply chain risk management considers things like supply chain disruptions. A type of supply chain disruption is product fraud. So all of a sudden, it's not you throwing over the fence this thing, say, hey, you need to add something else to you that you've never heard of. Now we're looking at it from their standpoint. And we're saying, okay, good management, good risk management, good disruptions, this thing. Now we have a way for that information to fit in. It's no longer an ad hoc, undefined risk. We now have something where it goes into the system. Second, that's important is let's review this risk in relation to all other risks. Now, is it bad if there's a food safety incident or food fraud incident? Of course, it's bad. But how bad? Do you stop production? Does your company go out of business? Things like that. So we're looking at this balance. The key is then when it's in the system, it goes in and it's judged. It's ranked whether it is above the risk tolerance or not. I'm not saying a food safety issue would be above a risk tolerance, but the type of things like what buyers, who do you buy from and things. So that's where we've shifted it completely, because now there's a place for us to receive the information in the business of food safety, food quality, food safety culture. Before we were just yelling, saying something's wrong, and that really is inefficient.
Right. Yeah, exactly. This is kind of that old model of quality control, right? It's like, okay, we'll buy this stuff and then we'll, pull some random samples when it gets to the plant and make sure it's in conformance. It doesn't work. Mm-hmm. To your point with the basement analogy, right? I'm just going down in the basement and putting tape on the cracks. It doesn't do any good.
Yeah. So, and the thing is that now with, for food fraud, it started there with just the testing, because we're trying to find melamine. 1822 is when it was first clearly defined. And you think about it, Sudan red was 2004 or so. Melamine was 2007. Horse meat was 2013. Mm-hmm. So it's been going on and on and on. I think the fundamental change was GFSI. Mm-hmm. That there's no question. GFSI was a fundamental change. At that point, there was more research, like our group looking at prevention, interdisciplinary, taking a quality management approach. It's no longer just testing your way there or waiting or responding to a problem. It's trying to be proactive. That's quality management. That's HACCP, but for food fraud. And GFSI said that food fraud is a possible root cause of a food safety incident. So that is critical to address in the GFSI standard. That then led to the food safety standards having addressed food fraud be mandatory. And more than that, was the key for the food industry compared to all other industries, is that there was a common definition, scope, and response. GFSI doesn't require a lot, but it does require the full scope of all fraud, not just adulterant substances. It requires a vulnerability assessment, and there's a lot more standards and training. The SAFE organization and others have that, USP. We have a food fraud initial screening tool. So there's a standardized approach. The auditors are looking at it, and they're sharing those best practices, and then the prevention strategy. And now, it was I don't know how many years ago it was, 5 years ago maybe. I was at a conference at University or Queen's University Belfast, and standing around, and it was interesting. There was someone from the U.S. and someone from someplace in Europe, and they said, "Oh yeah, food fraud. We do VASP." They said, "We do VASP too." And I was like a proud papa or something, because the thing is VASP, vulnerability assessment and critical control point plan, that's food fraud. But they both knew what it was. And they both could talk about it's a thing. They knew what that is. Two people that two different industries, they knew that. So we've evolved quite a bit.
Interesting. I mean, yeah. So then part of this too, right? When you're going through that process, right? There's a couple of key elements on that, right? Is those critical ingredients that, let's say you have a single source and this is something that's unique to your product that you have to buy. And then there's also the other side where you buy a whole lot of something. Right. Mm-hmm. So if something goes wrong with it, even though it's relatively low risk, it can impact your business immensely. Right. So,
right.
I come from dairy. So let's say something like DHA or, some type of, specialized oil or things like that. There's not a whole lot of people who make that. Right. So you're pretty locked in versus sugar. Right. You can buy it from a whole lot of places, but it's going to impact your product greatly if something goes wrong. So addressing those type of things. And so with that VASP approach, you're looking at it in those terms. Now, on this topic then, John, of kind of integrating all these different functions in, one of the things that I've tried to do is to get that perspective into other different departments, right? So I'm curious about your thoughts on this. So if I'm a procurement guy, right, and I look at my job description and I look at how I'm reviewed at the end of the year and what my bonus is, it's almost always based upon what's going on in procurement, right? Which is, okay, you need to buy the stuff. You need to buy the stuff at a good price. You need to make sure it gets to our operations, right? If you do a good job at that, I'm the boss and I'm happy. Right. How do we then get that idea of this interconnected supply chain into their thought processes when they're purchasing?
Yeah. Well, and that's another thing. It's interesting. Some of my colleagues here are management professors. They study how organizations change, how they are measured, success metrics, performance, results. And so interacting with them, it's interesting to really see that those changes, those fundamental structural changes, do not happen from the ground up.
Right.
And a good vice president of procurement is good at shielding their people from a lot of BS that other people try to add to them. Stay focused on the main goal. Tell me what my metrics are. Now, if you say, oh, you should worry about this, you should worry about that. So look, I've been given my metrics from above. My job is to meet my metrics. My job isn't to change everything in the world and address stuff. I'm supposed to meet my metrics. Now, if my metrics are wrong, it's not you, someone parallel or below me, to change it. It's the bosses. It's not my job to change everything. Now, we could suggest it. So that's the key, that if it comes from the bottom, it won't happen. And, there's been companies where, yes, the procurement manager knows the food safety manager and they adjust things like that. But that's a relationship. That's an oddity that's not a repeatable task. It's not, repeatable there. So even that type of company had to change and to go from the top down. And that then to say, okay, well, how do we get this to the top? How do people look at it at the top? There's enterprise risk management. I mean, that's exactly what it is. This is not just like, oh, I know how to do risk summing, I put it all together. That's not this. This is real certification, regulation of how companies are managed. So at that point, then, when we're looking at it from the top down to say, what are the risks in our business? Let's harvest them and then assess them. Now, from the top down, like in supply chain risk management, there's a place to talk about fraud, and it can be judged. At that point, then, it's from the top down saying, what is an acceptable risk tolerance? Can you buy from a supplier that you've never visited? Let's take that as an example. Mm-hmm. Yes or no? Well, is it yes or no always? Or is it yes or no conditionally? So, but the thing is, coming from the top says it is outside of our risk tolerance to buy from somebody that we haven't met. If you happen to buy from someone you haven't met, you have to do this series of other tests. Now procurement has from the top down, because it's not about, well, in that case, let's say that it costs the company twice as much. Well, that buyer can't be held accountable for changes in the corporate risk. The budgets would change, things like that. That comes from the top down. So that's the key, is it's not going to happen holistically from the bottom or organically. It has to come from the top, and that's within those management systems.
Right. No, yeah, completely agree. And so I've ran quality at some pretty large companies. And to your point, right, I would get with the head of procurement and say, listen, totally get, these are your objectives, right? You want to buy stuff, you want to buy at the right price, et cetera, like we talked about. And I would sit down with them and say, you want to do that as efficiently as possible, and I don't want to stop you from doing that. So let's put some steps in to make an initial first pass to find that level of trust, right? So if your procurement guys are able to figure out quicker that a supplier isn't worth pursuing, great, we can move on to the next one and figure out if they're going to be acceptable. If they make it that first hurdle, then come get my team and we can start asking some more detailed questions to make sure that this agreement and this arrangement is going to move forward correctly, right? It's trust. And if I don't know these guys and I don't trust these guys, I'm going to ask some questions. And my team did a really good job, right, of doing those initial conversations to uncover some stuff. We were launching a new product with a brand new ingredient we had no knowledge about at all. Mm-hmm. And we got the documentation from procurement, right? And they would gather it and then we would evaluate it. Mm-hmm. And we started looking at the HACCP plan at the time. And I'm like, there's some questions I've got here that aren't going to be really answered during email. So we got this guy, the company owner, on the phone, and he was in the Philippines. And I started asking some questions, and he stopped me after a period of time and he said, hey, you know what, Bryan? Let me be honest with you. I hired a local student from the university here to put together this information because they told me I need this to be able to sell to you. Mm-hmm. Oh, okay. Right. Yeah. That means I've got to send somebody to go visit this operation, mm-hmm. right? Because now my level of trust went way down.
Yeah. Well, and so let's look at you talking to the procurement manager.
Yeah.
So now, if you really do know each other, let's say it's a smaller company and you're both trusted, you both know the owner, and the owner says, I'm not buying anything unless Bryan says it's okay. Well, right there is an actual process, mm-hmm. from the top down. And Bryan knows his role. And over the time, Bryan talks with the CEO to figure out what that is. Now, Bryan could have a bad day and say, yeah, approve them, or a really good day and catch something. But that's very informal. And so there with that discussion, it's great. But there was a situation it was a manufacturing company that identified counterfeit products in their replacement parts in their supply chain, a lot of them. And they were really just substandard. I mean, they still worked, but they wouldn't have the number of hours for what it is. And so procurement said, oh, I clearly understand that. Yes, of course we need holograms or whatever it is on there. Okay, Bryan, what budget should I charge it to?
Yeah.
No, yeah, because I mean, it's not that's your problem. You've identified it. I'm worried about it. Yes, but I don't have the budget for that. So Bryan, where is it coming from? Yeah, if you give me the line, give me the account number, and we'll go buy them. And then that packaging anti-counterfeiting group was going crazy. But the thing is think about it. That makes sense. It's not purchasing's job to add costs to the business. If it's required, it's coming from the top down. And then it's a requirement of the business. Then they have budget for it. So that's the real situation. And I mean, is that bad? No, it's good business practice. So what we need to identify is where is that breakdown, and don't blame the person you're talking to. A lot of times they don't have any issue now, or any role in taking that on, like buying something to solve your problem. But that's a matter of corporate strategy. Now the second thing is a lot of people aren't calibrated to what is that risk tolerance and what is the expectation. So let's say we're making sunglasses.
Mm-hmm.
So let's say you're making $5 sunglasses. You're selling them at gas stations on I-75 from Michigan down to Florida. Students buy them on the way to Florida and have them for 2 weeks and love them. $5 sunglasses. But you say, oh, wait a second, those are too low quality for us. We need to increase the quality of it. We need to make $20 sunglasses because we need to have better frames and we can last longer, things like that. Well, now wait a second. Do you really understand the customer here? Now, if all things being equal, if you keep the cost the same and increase the quality, the value goes up. And value is defined by the customer. If those students are loving the $5 sunglasses and they break in a week, who cares?
Yeah.
They're not expecting $500 luxury sunglasses that are going to be impact resistant and polarized. So you might think that we should improve the quality, but that might not be the reality. So is a $5 pair of sunglasses better than a $500 pair of sunglasses? It depends on the customer. And they're the ones that define which one meets their needs. $500 pairs of sunglasses, even if you sold them for $200 in those gas stations on the way to Florida, would be unacceptable to that consumer. So two things here. One is to see what's the decision-making system. And if it's not in there for your problem to fit in whoever has to pay for it, that's a structural problem from the corporate side. The other is that we do have a lot of times a lack of calibration of what is acceptable quality, and it's not you to define it; it's the customer in the marketplace.
You're speaking my language. This is something that I've trained my team on forever, and it's something, John. I think I want to reemphasize that point that you made because I want to make sure everybody watching this caught that. Quality is defined by the consumer, right? And a lot of times in companies, we get caught up in this navel gazing inside the company of what we think it is. And no, right? So for example, we would be talking about, like we made silk soy milk or something like this. And I never got a complaint from a customer that said, hey, I pH'd your product and the pH was 0.02 above, specification. No, right? They will contact you and say, hey, I bought this silk and it tastes funny, right? It's not what I expect. Figuring out what the consumer expects for your product is absolutely mission critical, and then focusing on those things and then kind of putting the other ones to the back, right? Fine, you can have these technical parameters that you measure internally, but that's not the decision point on the product. This cup of coffee, these coffees that we're drinking today, when we poured these this morning, we had expectations on what that was going to taste like. Have a certain level of bitterness. Here's the temperature. I add in the half and half. It comes up to the top and you smell it and you're like, right? All those things. And what people fail to realize is people complain if it's worse. But to your point, John, which was perfect, they also complain if you make it better, right? People want what they want and you have to deliver that.
That's it. And so again, for me, so think about this. I've been packaging, worked at Chevron, food safety graduate program, working with working professionals. And now I'm talking to 20-year-olds that are just beginning their supply chain management careers in academia. And so even things like talking about, it's been really fascinating to step back and have to explain quality to them and to go look at the literature and, to discuss that the $5 sunglasses and the $500 sunglasses both could meet the quality and performance needs. And that's really hard for people to understand. But then also, again, to step back and see how are these management systems created, and where the system weakness is not you and me and the purchasing manager not listening. The system weakness is the overall, ability to assess the risk tolerance and have that into the business. And
Yeah.
no one has
So
unlimited resources. That's the
exactly.
problem.
So very often it's just as important. I mean, choosing what we do is just as important as choosing what we don't do.
Yeah.
Right. So yeah, I had a good story on that too. So back in the old days when I was working in a company, and the whole E. coli crisis hit 015 and all these type of things, and all of a sudden all of our customers are contacting us and demanding that we test for E. coli in the products. And we were already testing for coliforms, right? So I would try to explain to the customers and say, hey, listen, totally understand why you're concerned, but if the coliforms is less than 10 CFUs per gram, guess what? There's no E. coli. And they're like, we don't care. We don't care. You have to test for this or we're not going to buy from you. So I was pretty frustrated.
Yes or no? Yes or no?
Exactly. So I went to my boss frustrated and said, geez, these customers, this is going to cause all kind of issues. And he said something that stuck with me. He said, Bryan, anything can be done for a price. Go to the laboratory, find out how much it's going to cost, add in a buffer, figure out the lead time for the products, and get back to the customers. I was like, okay. So I went through all that work and I went back to the customers and said, okay, great, we can do that for you. It's going to be an extra $300 per lot. It's going to add an additional 2 weeks lead time to the product, and we'll have to dedicate this specifically for you. And they went, oh, tell you
Never
what,
mind.
let me call you back and I'll see what my boss says.
Right.
Guess what? Test got waived. Yeah.
And that's the communication, and see that's more of this integrated supply chain approach. It's looking at the business operations. This is no longer, I mean, it has to fit in, whether it's food safety, food science, and others. It just needs to get back integrated in to just how we do business. So if we step back, and we just finished some modules and a really tough exam that covered processes, quality, lean. And so a big key there is looking at the evolution of quality. And I remember starting at Chevron in 1991, and it was Crosby and Deming and this and that. And it was just a flavor of the month, quality. Yeah, we're doing that now. And it was always just the plant checking if, at the end of the production line, it was off spec or not, and they just scrapped it or not. But all of a sudden, look ahead, and now we've got Six Sigma, things like that, HACCP. No one would argue that Six Sigma and HACCP are not critical to a business operations. That was not the case in 91. This was just a flavor of the month, something different. So we're implementing these systems. We're seeing how they work. And that's, I think, the same thing of business management. Now that we've got more information flow, the resources are getting there. We're seeing enterprise risk management, whether it's an insurance company, is moving that down to decision making on the front level. And so now we have this real clear level, clear discussion about how much is enough. Now, in parallel to that is a topic that's not very exciting. What's very, very charged to talk about is acceptable level of protection, ALOP. And it was maybe 10 years ago, there was a lot of research, 15 years ago, a lot of research in that area, because it's another thing to say for that customer, is it acceptable level of protection for them to not do that test? It might be or it might not be, but everybody has a different level of acceptable. Now, let's also look at international. So let's say that I go to Toronto and I eat the food of Toronto, whatever it is that they make there, maple syrup or something. Let's say I have their maple syrup and I get terribly sick because there's something in it, a microbe. But no one in Toronto, no one in Canada gets sick because of it. Now, does that mean that product is dangerous? Well, to me it is, but what's the acceptable level of protection there for the local population? Should they change the entire way that they process maple syrup because I got sick, because my immune system didn't have it, or if they come here and they get sick of something here? So the idea of quality and what's acceptable, it's not exactly precise. It takes a lot of review, and it's looking at the consumer. It's looking at quality. It's looking at how it's judged, and it's really tricky. But it has to step back to this overall management system.
Well, yeah, and we see that. I like the analogy there with the other countries, right? Because as Americans, right, let's say that we go on vacation in Mexico, right? All of a sudden, our food safety awareness goes way up, right? It's like, am I going to order the fresh salad? No, I don't think so. Am I going to get that nice glass of top water? Heck no, right? And the things that we don't even give a second thought to in the U.S., we go to a foreign country, now all of a sudden it's like, not quite too sure about that, right? Yeah. And so those variables need to be considered.
Yeah.
The other side on the supply chain too is these one-off situations, emergencies, right? And we're seeing this right now with supply chain disruptions, where we've been getting this supply of this ingredient overseas from this customer forever. Now all of a sudden, whack, right? That supply chain is not working, and the procurement guys are freaking out, and they're looking everywhere to find an alternate supplier, and they don't care, right? We've got to keep the plants running. Let's find this, right? And everybody's pushing to get this done. How does that kind of fit into this overall process?
Well, see, there again is that when we're looking at it from a food safety, even just from a food fraud risk, then we don't have all the considerations. So it's like, so your foot hurts and you go to a podiatrist to look at your foot. That's not a general practitioner. Now they may look at your foot and say, "Oh, you've got some swelling." Well, the swelling might be because you're eating too much salt or something else, a thyroid, something. But they're a foot doctor. So that's kind of like us so foot doctors are critical for foot problems. And if we're food safety or food fraud, we're looking at that specific problem. So that's, again, I think, looking at the big picture there. And if we understand all these other factors, then we can start to see how we are more efficient with food fraud prevention. And let's look back at so COVID, actually now Ukraine is a current supply chain disruption here as of March 3rd. And so let's look at COVID when it hit. Is that at the very beginning, production shut down. So we're not only looking at getting quality product, or we're not even looking at lean operations, just in time, reducing inventory. It's now assurance of supply, AOS. And that's something we don't usually consider that much. Again, when I'm talking about teaching procurement and looking at supply chain management, assurance of supply is almost taken as a given, or was. And now we're looking at alternate suppliers, multiple sources, not going to single source, not sourcing from one region or another, but also then looking at the assurance of supply of how we could change our product mix. So at the beginning of COVID, there were bread companies that made 150 types of bread that went down to making 10 types of bread because there was so much demand and lack of the chia seeds or something unique. But in that case, then here's another supply chain concept of economic order quantities and also economies of scale. So if they're switching between 150 breads, there's a lot of change over time, downtime. If they're making only 10 bread, they might have one fill line that only is making one bread 24/7. That line's also going to get more and more efficient. So a key then is when we're looking at these disruptions, it's having this bigger picture of where those risks might occur, and then we're more aware of this. There might be no chance of counterfeiting and all chance of diversion. Might be no chance of diversion, but it's all adulterant substance or dilution. And if we look at the big picture of those factors, the supply chain disruptions, what's happening in the world, the global market prices, and then we can start to understand where our system weaknesses. And then we can be the podiatrist that's looking at the bone between your big toe and your foot.
Interesting. Yeah. Speaking of, Ukraine. So we see in our Facebook feed, I've seen it from my friends and things like this, support Ukraine, these type of things. And it's like, the flower of Ukraine is the sunflower. And one of my customers is having disruptions with getting sunflower oil.
Yeah. So the big thing is whether it's Ukraine or COVID or melamine or Texas ice storm or Suez Canal, those are all supply chain disruptions. And a best practice is to have a group that looks for potential disruptions. Now that if you all of a sudden are decide, hey, let's go place another order for Ukrainian sunflower oil. Now, I haven't tried to go on the market to do that, but I would guess, especially, as of 2 days ago, the major Black Sea port is all of a sudden not Ukrainian. So any product that's at the port or was going to the port or leaving the port, it's probably not going anywhere. So it would have been best to have a system where early on you're looking at these suspected or potential disruptions, and then starting to put plans in place and have a trigger and think about back to your doctor. So if you've been really tired lately, you go to the doctor and they say, okay, let's keep an eye on this. Your blood work looks good. You don't have any lumps, things like that. So this weekend, why don't you just stay in, get in bed early, watch a movie, drink some green tea and this kind of stuff. Let's take the weekend rest, and then let's talk to you next week. Come back in next week. Are you better or not? Okay, we've got something else. Let's look at your blood pressure. Let's go deep. And that's the same thing with disruptions, is to then say, let's look at these things over time. So to look at this specific situation now is then to say, what product does Ukraine make? what product is shipping around the world. And if they have 50% of the supply of sunflower oil, then even if you buy your sunflower oil from California, you may get the assurance of supply, but all of a sudden, force majeure, price goes up. The price, if half the sunflower, and I don't know the specifics, but let's say that it's half the sunflower oil, then all of a sudden you must expect the market price to skyrocket, double,
Right.
more.
And skyrocketing markets catch the attraction of fraud, right? So now people start poking holes in that basement saying, if I get some cheap rapeseed oil and blend it in with some other stuff and call it sunflower oil, I bet I can make a quick buck.
So that's the key, that if we look at only the one situation, we may miss something bigger. So actually, literally yesterday in class, I had an application case study of Ukraine and looking at the supply chain disruption. And I gave the students a scenario that they were a bread buyer, a raw material bread buyer for Meyer is a big store in Michigan, and so a lot of them would go work there. So you're the bread buyer for Meyer, and your boss says, "Hey, what's this Ukraine thing? I'm coming when I get back from lunch. Give me an update." Well, you think about you're buying the raw materials for bread in Michigan. What's Ukraine? And we covered the Tonga volcano as well. What's the disruption and impact there? Well, nothing really for that, and Tonga doesn't make much. Bad for the people from Tonga. But then let's look at this to say, what's the ripple effect? So number one is if you don't buy any product from the Ukraine, that's a first level. But let's say Ukraine may not be a big producer of wheat, but Russia is. So all of a sudden, then let's think about production in Russia. Let's think about transport of goods from Russia out of Russia. The banking system, if they can't sell the product and you can't buy the product, there could be a lot of wheat stuck in Ukraine,
Right.
or in Russia. So the thing is, if we step back for the bigger picture, we're not only looking at sunflower oil, but to say, what about wheat? What are other products? Then we're looking at direct, indirect, and the ultimate supply chain. If you make deli meat, then what if the price of bread goes up to $20 a loaf? How soon would it go up that high? I mean, think how much wheat is in the supply chain. Any wheat that's in the supply chain, unless it's already paid for, is the price could be spiking up. So all of a sudden it could be $20 a loaf. Well, how does that, as the additional effect, how would that affect how much deli meat is used? So all of a sudden, then, if we look at this big picture from the supply chain disruption, integrated supply chain approach, we're looking at sunflower oil from anywhere, not just from Ukraine. Then we're also looking at wheat. We're looking at corn, energy prices, because natural gas flows from Russia, the big source, through the Ukraine to Europe. So what about products that are made in Europe if energy prices go up? At that point, then we look at multiple products. We expand the list and also then be very specific. Like you said, sunflower oil, to look closely at that. Maybe you occasionally do the massive big tests of everything. And as long as your suppliers know you're testing a lot, then they're going to be careful with that. But then it could be these other products as well where there's stress.
Right. Wow. It gives me a headache just thinking about it. Right. And yeah, because part of this, right, I think this kind of ties in with this philosophy of just in time, right? It's like, okay, we'll buy just enough in our systems, keep our cash flow nice. And well, if you're following that super tight, guess what? You're putting yourself at risk now too. Now, the other side is just as risky, right? If you have months of material sitting in inventory, now you got to sit on all that stuff. That's not good for the business either.
Yeah. And that is integrated supply chain management. You're thinking about all the specifics, so that's the thing is, and it was great in class to go through this because, I mean, so 500 really engaged students, this is, they're entering their degree program, they're applying this, whether it's finance, accounting, whatever, they're engaged. So we started looking at say, oh my gosh, how do I start? Yeah, I'm worried about it. And oh my God, there's this and that. It could be this. So hold on, we need to have a process approach. And that is the core of supply chain management, process management, defining processes. So we think about, let's scope the problem. Let's figure out what's happening. Let's look at what we buy. Let's look at how we buy it. Then we move farther along to say, well, what's our call to action? And getting to actionable intelligence is the key. And that's the scenario I use to say, hey, you're the buyer. Your boss pops their head and says, hey, I'm going to be back from lunch in an hour. Tell me what you think about this Ukraine thing for our bread products. And that then leads people to look at actionable. Again, should we increase our stock of product right now? Should we buy things? Should we start to do testing? And that leads to that. You get to a process approach, and it makes you go down to look at, what should we do actually today? Well, on top of that is then triggers. So let's say, and one thing we did is we looked at the timeline. So It was, so it was November when troops started to be at the border, and it was about mid-January when things got pretty tense, and it was around mid-February when President Biden said that an invasion was imminent. So there's a couple of things there. So troops at the border. If there's troops at the border, now think about it. We constantly have war games in Germany, in South Korea with the South Koreans, within pretty close to North Koreans. So if you're North Korea, you might be worried about that. So being at the border is not a big deal, but that might at least get on our radar. Mm-hmm. Let's look. And then along the way, and then to say when the president said it was imminent, now is that really just saber rattling negotiation, this and that? But still, all of a sudden, then you think the percent chance it went up a little bit. Now, if you have in your supply chain disruption management system a process, you would start to do things like you'd start to say, well, I think that sunflower oil might start to get stressed. And so at that point, you may go from level 1 to level 2 testing of sunflower oil, or you may go from level 2 to level 3, or just monitoring or double checking things. And that's the key of looking at the big picture, is then you step back to see what could be happening. And you want to put, proactive plans in place so that so the bad guys don't hit you.
So within a company, then, so say you're not a small mom and pop operation. You've got different people with different departments and things like this. Who should kind of be sitting back and going, and asking these type of questions and bringing those to the rest of the organization? Should this kind of be a multidisciplinary thing, or should the procurement group lead it, or what are you thinking, John?
That's the question to ask. Yeah. And actually, I literally covered this in lecture yesterday. There's two ways that risk assessments start. One is a crisis, an incident. And so melamine, whatever, put the team together and look at it, solve the problem. The other is that there's a holistic approach. That's one thing GFSI is pushing, is to say you have to have a vulnerability assessment for food fraud and a prevention strategy. It doesn't say anything else. And so that's the two ways it starts. So it's critical now as we get, as companies are looking at COVID and how they dealt with it. And now with Ukraine, is we're in the midst of crisis level here, trying to figure out what could go on, how long, duration. I don't know specifically, but I'm going to guess that there's not a lot of farmers harvesting agriculture production in Ukraine right now. Right. And I'm going to guess there's not a lot of farmers planting seeds for the next sunflower seed crop. So those are, but we don't know yet, but those are things you could kind of guess. So, you've got to work on assurance of supply. You've got to look at this, fighting the supply and demand changes. But at the end of that, you should look back and say, okay, what do we wish we had in place? Number one, did we like the process we had? Was it efficient? Did we like the information we got? Maybe we need different information sources. The Bloomberg feed of commodity prices. Maybe the purchasing or the food fraud group looks at that too. And the big thing is process. Did we have a process to look at this? And so that sounds nice, warm, fuzzy. Let's have a process. Now we have to get to really actionable intelligence. And the details are, the real question is, if we had known, let's say that it's today when our company says crisis management, we're starting to do a review of the supply chain disruption So we're saying, what are we, the 4th? What could we have done, or would we have done, if we had this trigger moment 7 days ago, the date of right after the invasion, or a week before that, 14 days, or 30 days, or 60 days? That is the process improvement. Management professors will tell you that, to look at what decisions would have changed. Would or could is another key. So let's say that Bryan, you woke up 2 weeks ago and said, oh my gosh, this is it. I'm worried about Ukraine. Let's say we were talking about this 2 weeks ago and someone acted. So what could you do? You could increase inventories, this and that. But let's say, what would you do? Do you have approval to double the inventory on hand of sunflower oil? Do you have approval to extend or pay above market price for futures contracts of California sunflower oil? Probably not. So you'd be now going through the system in the midst. It's like, Bryan, come on. We got this COVID thing. We're just trying to, get trucks moving, and we've got bottleneck at the Port of Savannah. So again, to look at the system and say could and would. You could have done that, but would you have been able to, or would you have been prioritizing it? So at the end, we do the process check. And that's when we say Ukraine, COVID, melamine, ice storm in Texas, Suez Canal, did we have a process? And when things settle down, when are things going to really settle down? But that's the question to ask is did we have a good program in place?
Right, and that's absolutely key. I think that's a good way to summarize this. But before we move to the summary, though, I want to make sure that we got Jill's question answered for her. How far back in the supply chain do you recommend looking for disruptions? Suppliers of suppliers? How far do you go?
As far as you need to go. So there's a academic question, but in reality, that's the question to ask. So let's look at. So it would be really great to do a process review of how a company dealt with and responded to, like right now, Ukraine, in the middle, but COVID as well, or let's say multiple phase, COVID, Delta, and Omicron, and to see that. So let's split that one up, and then what were some concerns? So the key is that if you're buying a product from someone that uses Russian wheat and a Ukrainian sunflower oil, that's not your direct supplier. That's not your first tier supplier. It's your second tier supplier. To have some level of visibility. Now, even if they don't let you, it's a commercial secret and you don't know where they get their product, you still know the product. Let's say you buy the product from Germany and it's wheat, Russian wheat and Ukrainian sunflower oil. Now, you might not know exactly where they get their product, but you're saying it's Germany. You could estimate that they're probably getting it pretty close. So you'd say at least some of it's from Ukraine. So you have some level of visibility there. Now, you can't do that for every product, but there's a lot of key products. Another situation that I remember is it was some product that was coming from Argentina, and melamine was a concern. And so people say, "Oh, no, we're fine. We buy our product all from Argentina." It was some type of milk product. It was a dairy product, and then someone said, "Do they get all their product from Argentina?" They contacted the supplier. "Oh yeah, 50% from Asia." Well, wait a second. We just said first tier, we're buying all from people here. Second, another example is you remember the tsunami and nuclear fallout there in Japan.
Yeah.
So a lot of auto companies bought from 3 different suppliers, global suppliers. It happened that all their manufacturing was within 10 miles of each other there. So the third tier, fourth tier suppliers, everybody bought from the same place, and it shut down supply chains. So
an example on that side that I can think of is honey, right? So there's a lot of concern over Chinese honey, chloramphenicol, antibiotics in the honey and stuff like this. So a lot of procurement groups are like, China, I'm a little worried about honey from China. Well, I found out recently from talking with suppliers that China will send their honey to other countries, to India and other countries, have it repackaged and then sent out.
Yeah. Well, let's clarify. Some suppliers who are fraudulent and criminal actors that happen to be in the country of China export it. So it's not like it's but that's a key, because this is about crime. And it's about crime and opportunity. And so that the U.S. calls it honey laundering. And it went through 7 countries, and the dates were then changed by criminals. If we know the overall issue, like you don't know if the sunflower oil of your third tier supplier actually comes from the Ukraine, those are things you can start to look at. And at least you understand where your vulnerability is. Now, if you have a discussion with your supplier about your concern about your ability to buy their product, that's different than saying, where do you buy your product from? Who do you buy it from? And again, that's a supply chain.
Right. Well, it all gets back, and that's a great way to summarize this, right? Because when we're running short on time here again. I'm always amazed how quickly this time goes by. It's the process, John, right? And so you've got this little meter, right? That's right. And you're looking at these different things, and then you start triggering this process and asking these questions. And I think a big part of this too, and we see this in crisis management and recalls and things like this. An important part of this process that a lot of people skip over is, right, you go through a situation like this and everybody goes, "Oh man, that was horrible. All right, let's move on." It's like, well, no. Let's take a look at what happened, why it happened, and what we can do to learn from that to improve our processes in the future.
That's right.
Very important. Well, man, amazing conversation. Let's see. So Cortland had a comment here. So risk assessment must include requirements for analytical testing to meet the supply chain, pesticide residues, et cetera. Yes, but I think kind of going back to, Cortland, what we were talking about earlier is you can't inspect in what we're talking about here, right? There are active agents who are working against you to try and fix these things. So that process needs to look at those things holistically and figure out, okay, is this a problem or not? And where does that fit on our hierarchy of things that we need to look at? So I think that's important too.
If there's a list of 10 bad chemicals, bad guys are smart. They're going to go to number 11, 12, 13. You can't test
Mhm.
for everything, and they're going to evolve and adapt. Now, yes, of course, we need to do testing, but the key is then to say, which tests, and maybe it's a battery of tests. Maybe it's the non-targeted testing occasionally. So there's a role, but we really have to look at the problem itself. One thing that happened in the pharmaceutical industry is they got great at anti-counterfeiting features on their product, and it shifted to cargo theft. People were stealing trucks of pharmaceuticals, and now stolen illegal product is entering the market.
Wow.
So that actually risk. You solve one risk and you create an even bigger risk. So how do you test stolen goods to confirm that it's not fake or packaging? That's a big thing. Is anti-counterfeiting features that are on packaging. You're tracking the labels, not the product.
Absolutely. Wow. We could easily go for another couple hours. I would love to, but unfortunately we can't. And this has been amazing, John. Thank you very much. This is everything I thought it would be. So I really appreciate your time.
Thank you, everybody. Take care.
And so thank you, Kimberly, for the comments. Appreciate it. So I hope everybody enjoyed our chat here this week. A ton of information. We can see why Dr. Spink is one of the leading experts in the country and why Michigan State is one of the leading schools out there. So definitely look them up, look at their information, reach out to John. Can't say enough about the programs they're doing there and the amazing thing that they do. Now, part of what we want to do, and Renee is going to be putting out some links on this as well too, and we have my email here too. What topics do you want us to talk about here on the chat? What type of guests would you like us to have on? We're getting amazing people on. Who else would you like me to go out there and pursue to bring on the chat so that we can learn from them? So send me an email with your ideas. Send it to Renee. We would love to hear. So we will be back here next week at the same time. So on March 11th at 8 a.m. Mountain, 10 a.m. Eastern for the next food safety chat. And hopefully you'll be able to join us live, because having this interaction is why we're here. We love sharing this information. We all get better as a result of this, because all of these type of issues we talk about here, right? Not points of competition. These are all things that everybody needs to be following so that we can maintain a safe food supply here in the US. So, and around the world, right? Everybody wants safe food. So thanks again to my guest, Dr. Spink, and we will see everybody here next week. Have a great weekend, everybody. Thanks a lot.